Good evening and welcome, everyone. I am Mary Nettles, President of the Chatham Community NAACP and President of the Community Remembers Coalition Chatham. The grant program of the Community Remembers Coalition Chatham and the two Chatham NAACP branches, 5377 and 5378, are so happy you took time out of your schedule to join us. We invite you to become a member of the CRC-C by going to our website, crc-c.org, and stroll down to the home page to the Join Us section. We are looking forward to welcoming you to our group. Our book discussion tonight will be Fragile Democracy, the Struggle Over Race and Voting Rights in North Carolina. Fragile Democracy is a powerful told story of how the rights to a living wage, quality education, decent housing, and more is directly affected by who votes at this critical moment in history. And that knowledge is at the root of epic struggles for democracy. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals says that North Carolina voter suppressing law have targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision. The author, James Lalutis and Robert Kostad, will walk us through how and why. James L. Lalutis is a professor at history, Peter T. Grainer, Associate Dean for Honor Carolina, and Director of the James M. Johnson Center for Undergraduate Excellence at College of Art and Science at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Robert L. Kostad is Professor Emerit of History and Public Policy, Stanford School of Public Policy, Duke University. We hope you find tonight's presentation enjoyable, beneficial, and educational. So please sit back, get comfortable, and don't forget to mute your device. Following the presentation, there will be a time for questions. Please enter your questions by the chat. Thanks again for being here. And at this time, I return the program over to Professor James Lalutis.
Mary, thanks so much for that introduction. And let me just say at the beginning how much Bob and I have been looking forward to being a part of this event this evening. You're doing such important work in Chatham County, and we genuinely feel privileged to have an opportunity to be a part of that this evening, and we're looking forward to the conversation. I'm going to switch to a few PowerPoint slides here in a few minutes, so just so you don't have to look at me through the rest of the talk. But first of all, just to say a little bit about the book. So Fragile Democracy is a book based on, at this point, nearly a decade's worth of work that Bob and I have been doing as expert witnesses in a series of lawsuits in North Carolina in both state and federal court, focused on issues of race and voting rights, beginning all the way back in 2013 with House Bill 589. Now, I'll say a little bit more about that later on, but you may remember that was the omnibus election law reform passed by the Republican majority in the legislature in 2013, the most sweeping revision of election law in the nation. And it was that law that the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled, as Mary said, targeted, in the opinion of the court, that law had targeted minority voters with near surgical precision. And as Bob and I have been doing this work, we increasingly thought it important to take this work and turn it into a book that was written, that was crafted for a general audience of people like you who are deeply concerned with fundamental issues of racial justice and equity and democracy, issues that touch the lives of us all in North Carolina and, in fact, across this country. We wanted a book that would help people understand the the kind of North Carolina's long and cyclical history of voter suppression. Voter suppression that, as we'll try to illustrate this evening, was accomplished through measures that often on their face appeared to be race neutral, but in their implementation proved and continue to this day to prove to be profoundly discriminatory. Let me switch to a screen share here and just share some images with you as we move along. Well, what this book does is it looks back over nearly a century and a half of North Carolina history. And what we do in the book is identify three of those cycles that I just described to you. The first cycle spanned a period of about 35 years between the death of slavery at the end of the Civil War and black disenfranchisement in 1900. This first cycle was marked at the beginning by North Carolina's really quite remarkable 1868 Constitution. That document was crafted by a remarkable biracial coalition within what was then North Carolina's new Republican Party. That Constitution granted all adult men the right to vote, and also importantly, the right to cast their votes in free elections. Now, not every state constitution offers that guarantee, and it is one of the reasons why the struggle to enforce and protect voting rights in North Carolina, at least legally, has something of an advantage within state courts, because we have this constitutional guarantee of the right to participate in fair and free elections. And you can get a picture here literally of that biracial alliance. This is a picture taken of the state legislature in 1872. And if you move up very close to your screens, you will see the large numbers of black men who served in that body, many of whom had been emancipated less than a decade earlier. Well, whites who called themselves conservatives with a capital C mounted, as I think you know, fierce opposition to this biracial alliance and to this broad democratization of North Carolina politics. I'm having some, there we go. That violence found expression through the Ku Klux Klan in the late 1860s and early 1870s, and also in the white supremacy movement of the 1890s, which culminated in 1898 in the Wilmington coup and racial massacre. If you don't know David Zucchino's book, Wilmington's Lie, I commend it to you. It's an extraordinary account of those events in Wilmington that led in subsequent years to the disfranchisement of black men. This is a picture from that coup, from the white racial violence in Wilmington in 1898. If you look carefully at it, if we were in a classroom together, I'd ask you to tell me what you think this is, but I'll go ahead and reveal the answer. And you might get a clue by looking on the right side. There's a photographer's company name in Wilmington. This is a souvenir postcard from that coup, from the massacre of 1898. If you can imagine buying one of these things in the days afterward to send to all of your friends and acquaintances is proof that you were there for this historical event. What followed in 1899 and 1900 was the disenfranchisement of black men, effectively the removal of black men from politics in the state, the introduction of what was in effect one party, white supremacist government. That was accomplished through an amendment to the state constitution, adopted by the legislature in 1899 and ratified in 1900. Um, Black men were removed from politics. They were disenfranchised through the imposition of a poll tax, as you see in the clip at the bottom of this screen, and also by the implementation of a literacy test that required people who presented themselves to register and to vote to prove that they were literate by being able to read and write any section of the U.S. Constitution in the English language. Now, that appears on its face to be race neutral, but the law left lots of room, discretionary room, for white registrars to determine who would actually have to take the test, what would constitute the test, and what would count as a passing performance on the test. Again, if we were in a classroom, I would ask you as I ask my students, and I'm sure everyone on this call is highly literate. So if you have a piece of paper and a pencil handy, pull it out for me and take a moment and, if you would, write out Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution. I can tell you my experience in the classroom, standing in front of 100 or so of the best and brightest students in North Carolina, that I'm lucky if 2 or 3 of them know what Article 3 of the Constitution does. It established the judiciary. So you see the point about the literacy test, race neutral on its face, but in its implementation, profoundly discriminatory. Well, Bob, let me hand it over to you at this point.
Yeah, so thanks, Jim. The second cycle after the long Reconstruction that we identified spans the era of Jim Crow, from Black disenfranchisement in 1900 to the passing of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. In the latter half of this era, Blacks made significant incremental gains in voter registration by switching their allegiance from the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, the party of Reconstruction, and seeking to exercise influence within the party that ruled the state, the Democratic Party, the party of white supremacy. One of the chief proponents of this strategy was Lewis Austin, the editor of the Carolina Times, widely influential African-American newspaper published in Durham, still published. Austin and other influential Black leaders created the Durham Committee on Negro Affairs in 1935. And a few years later, a similar state committee. Their goal was to begin registering Black voters. Very few African Americans have been registered to vote for all the reasons Jim just detailed. And they also quite dramatically started supporting and running Black candidates for office, even in cities around the state where they knew they had not enough registered voters for those people to win, but to give people a sense of what was possible. That strategy was picked up and put into action by local voters movements affiliated with the NAACP across the state, and most dramatically by organized labor, particularly the food, tobacco, and agricultural workers. Now, the unionization of nearly 10,000, mostly African-American tobacco workers in Winston-Salem, and another 10,000 working in the leaf houses in Eastern North Carolina is the subject of a book I wrote almost 20 years ago called Civil Rights Unionism. And it's a story of the struggle in Winston-Salem for unionization, and also in Eastern North Carolina, and a sense of what was at stake here. For our discussion, what's important is that after securing a collective bargain agreement that won workers at R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company in particular better pay, benefits, and working conditions, the first thing members of FTA Local 22 did was to begin registering people to vote. And in many cases, the first thing they had to do was to begin to teach basic literacy skills to the hundreds and hundreds of men and women who worked in those factories, who had gone to work in those factories when they were children and had basically been denied access to an education, and the rudiments of literacy. In 1947, the union was able to use this power of organized workers to elect Reverend Kenneth Williams to a seat on the city board of Alderman. Reverend Williams was the first African American in the South to win an election against a white opponent since the turn of the century, a really momentous occasion in North Carolina history that most people don't have any idea about. Now, the success of Local 22, along with the return of hundreds of Black soldiers from World War II, sparked a rapid return of African Americans to electoral politics. By 1953, this has always seemed pretty amazing to me, 8 Black politicians had won election to local and county municipal governments in Greensboro, Winston-Salem, and North Carolina. And here, second from the left, is Reverend Butterfield, or Dr. Butterfield, in Wilson, North Carolina, who was elected to the city council. And the first thing he did was to use his influence and his power to start advocating for members of the African American community there. And there were a number of other people in Greensboro and Winston-Salem and a number of other smaller cities in the Eastern North Carolina who were in this first group of elected Black politicians who really sparked later developments for voting rights in North Carolina. So, Jim, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. Well, as had been the case in the late 19th century, the white backlash was swift and also wide-ranging. Down at the local level, say in a town like Wilson, it took the form of reorganizing municipal and county governments by moving from ward-based systems of representation to at-large systems of representation. And if you think about a ward system, which is neighborhood-based in a highly segregated society, in that system, if Black residents could register a sufficient number of voters, they had a shot at electing someone like G.K. Butterfield Sr. to the city council. The legislature in Raleigh responded to those gains, and again, 8 is an impressive number in context, but it is a small and incremental gain. But the legislature responded by restructuring county government, municipal government, particularly in Eastern North Carolina, where the Black population was concentrated, by putting in place now systems of at-large representation. And if we just think through the mathematics of that, an at-large system is always going to disadvantage any minority group of voters. We've all participated in those kinds of elections. When you go in and maybe there are 3 candidate seats open on the Chatham County Commission, the ballot says there are 5 candidates, vote for 3. It's going to be almost impossible in that situation for a minority voting population to prevail and elect a candidate of its choice. The only way to do that, to gain back some mathematical advantage, was through what was called single shot or bullet voting. And what that meant is that black electors would go to the polling place, the ballot would present, say, 5 candidates for 3 open positions, and instead of voting for 3, they would vote for the candidate of their choice and only the candidate of their choice. Well, the legislature understood that, it saw the consequences, and you can see the response here. This map spans a period of about 1952 to the early 1960s. And these shaded counties are all counties in which the legislature outlawed single shot balloting, single shot voting. So if you turned in a ballot and instead of marking 3 candidates, you marked only 1, your ballot was tossed out and not counted. It was an extraordinarily effective way of sort of building a dike against that growing black political power. At the state level, something similar was accomplished in the legislature itself by increasing the number of multi-member districts, again, particularly in eastern North Carolina, and by introducing something called numbered seat plans in the elections of representatives in those multi-member districts. What that meant is that, say you had 3 seats open in a multi-member district. There were 6 candidates, 5 white, 1 black. The numbered seat plan meant that election officials would treat each of those 3 seats as a separate election, which allowed them then to put the strongest white candidate up in opposition to the sole black candidate. Again, all these things on their face, they are race neutral, but in their implementation were profoundly discriminatory. And I think one number demonstrates the effect. By 1980, 15 years after the Voting Rights Act, only 4 black lawmakers served in the General Assembly in Raleigh. Now, the third cycle we identify in fragile democracy is the one that we're living in today. It began, as Bob said, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Here you see Lyndon Johnson sharing with Martin Luther King Jr. one of the pens he used to sign that legislation. So this third cycle begins with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, or to be more precise, it really begins with judicial enforcement of that legislation, particularly in the 1980s. The most important case in North Carolina was Jingles v. Edmonston in 1984. And in that case, the federal courts ordered the elimination of most, not all, but most of the multi-member districts in the state legislature. And the results were politically transformative. By 1989, 5 years later, 19 black lawmakers served in the General Assembly. And in 1991, Dan Blue was elected Speaker of the House. At that time, the highest state office to which a black candidate had ever been elected in North Carolina. So you have conditions here then for the formation again of a biracial alliance, a progressive biracial alliance, much like the one we saw in the post-Civil War years. This time, a biracial alliance that took shape within the Democratic Party and worked in subsequent decades to enforce voting rights, to expand access to the ballot box, and to safeguard that constitutional guarantee of free elections. And they did this in the 1990s and early 2000s by introducing a number of reforms that we're familiar with and take for granted today, things like early voting. same-day registration and voting, out-of-precinct voting. And the consequences of this little d democratization of the state's politics was perhaps most evident in 2008, when you'll recall Barack Obama won North Carolina by a margin of just over 14,000 votes. My daughters, who were too young to vote in that election but were old enough to canvass for Obama, had about a couple of dozen of their friends in the house that evening to watch the returns. And you may remember how long it took to finally call the election in North Carolina. I think we finally had to run them all out of the house at about 4 a.m. So that we could get some sleep. Well, we're all very familiar, I think, with the events that followed. It's recent history that we have lived through and experienced. And this time, the white backlash took the form primarily of the Tea Party movement. This is a Tea Party rally in Fayetteville that in 2010 gave conservative Republicans a majority in the state legislature. Those lawmakers then in 2012 drew new district maps as part of the redistricting that has to happen every 10 years based on the decennial census. They drew new maps that in 2012 produced for them a veto-proof supermajority. And in 2013, they passed, as I said at the beginning, the most comprehensive revision of election law in the nation, House Bill 589. And in a phrase, 589 attempted to roll back each and every one of those reforms that I listed for you just a minute ago. This is the law that, in the judgment of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, targeted minority voters, as Mary said at the beginning, with near surgical precision. Conservative lawmakers lost the battle for 589, but they were determined to win the war. In 2018, they regrouped, they focused their efforts, and they won public approval of a constitutional amendment that would require voter photo identification of all prospective voters who sought to register and cast a ballot. And you'll remember that campaign. It was grounded in charges of voter fraud. But we know from the North Carolina State Board of Elections' own audit of elections in 2012, 2016, there was almost no voter fraud that would have been prevented by a photo ID requirement. In fact, there were only 3 instances identified that would have been prevented by a photo ID. One was a woman whose mother had recently died, and her mother had been a great supporter of Donald Trump, and so the daughter impersonated her mother to cast her mother's vote. Only 3 cases of fraud. The argument also was that voter ID is common sense. You need one to see an R-rated movie, board an airplane, and so on. Of course, none of these things are true. Movie theaters don't card you. You can, in fact, board an airplane without a photo ID. It's complicated, but you can do it. You can cash a check. And all the major credit card companies prohibit merchants from requiring photo ID for the use of their cards. Nevertheless, these arguments are compelling. As one observer or proponent of voter ID put it, well, North Carolinians believe there's fraud, and so the requirement is necessary. And so here we are today. I testified in the trial earlier this year in which Superior Court in Wake County, that's where constitutional matters related to voting rights are heard, in which that court threw out the voter photo ID requirement as discriminatory. And that case, of course, is now being adjudicated in the state Supreme Court. What I'd say here at the end is that, the outcome of these contests are going to have profound consequences, not only for our democracy, but also for economic opportunity. And Bob touched on this just a minute ago, talking about black tobacco workers in Winston-Salem. Mary opened it and framed tonight's conversation with this observation that the struggle for voting rights is and always has been a struggle for economic rights, for economic democracy as well. And you can see evidence of that, I think, very clearly in the fact that the lawmakers who have sought to restrict voting rights have also worked over the last decade to limit the various forms of social provision that make for a more equitable and just and fair economy. They eliminated the Earned Income Tax Credit, which economists across the political spectrum generally agree is one of the most important and effective anti-poverty measures a state legislature or national lawmakers could adopt. They've cut unemployment benefits. They did so in the midst of the economic crisis that began in 2008. And on an inflation-adjusted basis, they've reduced public investment in education. And of course, it was this understanding and this joint kind of combined concern for both voting rights and economic rights that powered the Moral Monday movement. In the 2010s, you see here a photograph, that's William Barber on the lower left, but looking down Fayetteville Street in Raleigh is tens of thousands of North Carolinians turned out in an extraordinary rainbow coalition to contest this restriction of both political rights and economic rights. What we're dealing with here, I think, is a contest over the very substance and nature of our democracy and the efforts to establish a political and economic order that is less fair, less just, and with a little d, less democratic. And it's in that sense that this long struggle over race and voting rights we've tried to recount in broad terms tonight has had, does have, and will have profound consequences for each and every one of us who call this state home. Well, we'll end there. We'll invite you, we hope, to buy a copy of the book. And you can also take a look at, we've created a digital exhibit online that tells this story in really compelling period photographs from the time of emancipation to the present. Photographs and words. You can find more information on the book and also a link for this digital exhibit at our website, easy to remember, simply the title of the book.com, Fragile Democracy, one word.com. Well, let me end there, and Bob and I would be absolutely delighted to take your questions and to hear your thoughts about this story as as we're living this history in North Carolina today.
Well, the first question is was NC's extensive eugenics program designed in any way to swat voters? If not, how might it be related to our discussion?
We need to unmute, Jim. Oh, we got it.
Yeah, I think I am there.
I don't know.
Wow, what a great question. So let me take a pass at that. Um, and I'm going to put a really sharp point on this, in part because I've been reading a recent book on Southern politics in the post-World War II period. And it's something I just try to be provocative with my students in saying, and we don't think of American politics in these terms, but imagine looking at this story from the outside, particularly that story in the late 19th century and the establishment of Jim Crow, of one party white supremacist rule. We are, in effect, talking about the establishment of an authoritarian state. And if we look across the kind of broad sweep of European as well as American history, um, eugenics has been an important part of sort of defining the boundaries of citizenship in such a state, of trying to create the kind of racial purity that is at the heart of the argument for an authoritarian state built on white supremacy. So I do think you can make the connections there. And in fact, if you go and take a look at eugenicists across Europe in the 1920s and 30s, not just in Germany, you'll find, in fact, that they are often looking to the U.S. and in some cases looking particularly at North Carolina as a model for that kind of work. So it seems to me in that sense, the eugenics program in this state was quite tightly tethered to this larger racial political project.
I'd like to add that I never knew that the initial immigration program in the United States actually was based on eugenics at the time. And so it expands beyond North Carolina. It's just something I learned recently that I thought I'd throw in there. So another question is, North Carolina is not considered a deep South state. However, white North Carolinians seem to reflect the views of slaveholders that Blacks were lesser human beings. That is the root of perhaps that is the root of the deep fear and hatred of the Black population. Your thoughts?
Well, I'll start with that. I mean, I think that, it's a complicated question with a long history. And I would say from the work that Jim and I have done over the years on North Carolina history and look at issues of race, that that it's really important to understand the way in which elite groups in North Carolina have used racial divisions and just notions of race to create divisions within the larger population, whether it was in the antebellum South, where they're playing small landholders off against slaves, or in the late 1890s, the white supremacy campaign, stoking these fears of Negro domination and the possibility of Black assertion, whether it's in the workplace or in other areas. And you can look at that. You can look at the same thing that went on with the Tea Party movement, and we have some good examples in the book where conservatives are using all kind of racial tropes and kind of racial insinuations as a way of creating divisions between people who might have and probably do have social and economic issues and concerns that they share. So I think that trying to understand, it is, why do people seem in some cases to vote a racial ballot as opposed to an economic ballot? Why do they vote for people who's are not really looking out for their self-interest in all kind of policy ways? I mean, what Jim just told you about what the Republicans have done in the last decade in North Carolina has been disastrous for thousands and thousands of people who voted for those Republicans and will probably vote for them again. And again, I don't know. It's a very complicated issue that I think we need to address more straightforwardly than we do in this state.
You know, the kind of great historian of the American South, Van Woodward, who got his PhD at UNC in the 1930s and taught at Yale, he had an observation that I think summed up what Bob's suggesting here very neatly, and it was a reminder that the struggles over race and democracy in the South were not only struggles for white supremacy, they were also struggles to determine which whites would rule supreme. All right, so the ways in which then race and class are entangled in the policies of white supremacy. What's interesting also about North Carolina is that this is a deeply, deeply purple state, and that's not just a modern phenomenon. From 1865 all the way to the present, what you see in North Carolina politics is that you only have to move very small numbers of voters, that is, move very small numbers of white voters in one direction or the other, and the difference in the outcome is profound. And maybe the best contemporary illustration of that is 2008. Obama won by 14,000 votes. And so we look at Klan violence in the late 1860s. We look at the white supremacy campaigns and that violence in the 1890s. We look at expressions of similar things in the years that followed. What you see is that violence had a dual purpose. It was to intimidate and suppress and subjugate blacks. It was also to intimidate whites who crossed the race line and made common cause on an economic basis, on a class basis, with black North Carolinians. So we historically are a deeply purple state. And it is what makes politics in this state so interesting.
So you mentioned in your talk was that there were a number of race neutral policies, and there's a question about how can we, if some policy is put forward and it looks neutral, how can we more quickly understand maybe what the results of that might be and the appropriate measures to accommodate that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think part of the argument we'll make is the argument we've made in court, and that is that history matters. And one way to understand the implications of contemporary political action is to put it in a historical context. The details change, but if you think about the story we just told you, it's like a movie that just runs in an endless loop. There are changes, but the fundamentals are the same. And at the moment, at least, the federal courts, state courts as well, look at that impact, right? Not simply at intent, but what's the impact and what are the consequences? Now, it's not unlikely that in the coming years, the U.S. Supreme Court may well vacate Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. They've done that with Section 5, and if that goes, then we're going to lose the ability to make many of those sorts of arguments in a court of law. And this U.S. Supreme Court has a long history of being inclined to view things and to view as credible the claims of race neutrality. In fact, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that with regard to the literacy test.
You know,
Nothing in there, the court said, about race.
I think one way to, that particularly the lawyers who've been challenging these laws have really done their homework and looked at the statistics and looked at the impact that they have. I mean, so take the voter ID bill, and Jim has been very involved in this of really going and looking at who's affected by having who's affected by having a voter ID requirement. It's older people, it's students, it's African Americans, it's rural people. I mean, whether you use the language of race, the impact on certain parts of the population is going to be much greater than it is on others. And so, it's not a matter of what your intention is, because you can mask that. Nobody knows what your intention is. But the consequences of all of these things that we've been talking about, all of these laws that have been supposedly race neutral, the consequences have been profoundly discriminatory. And it doesn't, I mean, to be honest about it, it doesn't take a Nobel laureate to figure that out.
I'll give you one example. I think it has, given the demography of Chatham County, particular relevance here. When I was working on the expert witness report in the lawsuit related to House Bill 589, one measure of that in that legislation that I had mentioned to you is that House Bill 589 would have done away with North Carolina's pre-registration program. So that's the program that puts 16 and 17-year-olds on the roll so that when they turn 18, they're registered and ready to vote. And we were looking at that, and you looked at statistics about who benefited from that and so on, and there were no racial differences. And you're like, okay, so what's going on here? And then a colleague in the Carolina Population Center, a demographer, said, I've got the answer for you. And she showed me a graph that's in the book. And it's a graph that a chart of the Latinx population in North Carolina. And this axis is sort of number of qualified voters, and this axis is age. So if you're out here above 18, and as you move older and older and older, what you see is very, very few people who are citizens. But what's amazing in the graph is over here from 18 younger, there is a mountain of young Latinx North Carolinians born in the United States who would be entitled to vote when they turned 18. What an amazing measure, right? Talk about something that looks race neutral on its face. But it, you have to believe there was intent behind that, right? Certainly not a desire to see any program that would make it easier for these young people to register and vote.
A recent thing in Chatham County has been whether or not we would be able to vote on Sundays. That obviously affects a certain group of people who would vote perhaps more, be easier for them to vote on Sundays. And so that, the consequences of that, we haven't actually calculated them, but, it seems like that could be race-based. So there's a question, what is happening today to make voting fair in North Carolina?
Yeah, I mean, on your previous point, I mean, souls to the polls, right? And again, I mean, we have to remember, you just have to, just a small incremental differences in any of these categories adds up to a profoundly different outcome in an election.
I think that one thing in terms of what's making it easier. I mean, all of these things, there are all kinds of things that are making it harder. One of the things that's making it easier, I think, that's really important to understand, and it goes back to the story I was telling about the tobacco workers and unionization and their efforts, is the efforts of people who are opposed to these kinds of voter restrictions, the efforts that and the energy they're putting into trying to register and get people to vote and to participate. It's taken tremendous amounts of time and resources to do that, particularly in rural areas, where people's the rate of registration is low and the difficulty of registration is high. But in North Carolina, there are multiple groups of people, of organizations. Some are, established organizations like the NAACP. Others are organizations that are fairly recent, that are out working. They're going door to door. They're trying to talk to people about the consequences of participating in the political process. So, whenever there are these roadblocks, and in the past there have been those roadblocks, but people have found ways of getting around those and of making the system work for them. And I think we're seeing we're seeing another moment of that. I mean, I don't know what the results will be, but I think there's a lot of grassroots efforts to get around the restrictions that have been put in place, make it easier for people, to provide transportation, helping them register to vote, getting them to the polls, and also just educating people about what the issues are. Because I think that's one of the real limitations, is that people watch a few ads on TV and think that the real issue in this election is the Internal Revenue agents who are going to come down 600 or 700 strong to their house and take all their assets from them. I mean, that's so anyway. So I think that I think this mobilization, this organization is using a variety of kinds of institutions to participate in the political processes is something that's another historical lesson that I think is important.
And it's particularly important in this state because judges are elected. And if you step back and look at this history, that we were recounting, the contemporary, that third cycle, in part, I think you have to say thank God for lawyers and the courts, because so far that's the place we've prevailed. We've had some gains at the polls, but almost every piece of this, progressive forces in the state have been able to resist by resorting to the courts and to that guarantee of free elections in North Carolina's Constitution. So pay attention to judicial elections. Just one thing I'd add to that, I'm sure this is on people's radar screen, but probably the most significant threat to democracy in this state, or for that matter, meaningful democracy in this country, is the case currently pending before the U.S. Supreme Court that's been brought by the legislative majority in North Carolina. And as I think the state Supreme Court is poised to throw out voter ID. State Supreme Court just threw out gerrymandered legislative districts on the grounds that the legislature that created them was itself the result of extreme partisan gerrymandering and therefore was unconstitutionally elected on the basis of that guarantee of free elections in North Carolina's Constitution. And so the legislative majority has gone to the state Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, to argue that the federal Constitution gives state legislatures sole authority to determine the character of elections, congressional elections. Therefore, it doesn't matter what the state constitution in North Carolina says or what the state courts in North Carolina say. One really smart student in my class, the kid who's always sitting in the back of the room and raises his hand, in every class. We were talking about this, and he said, Professor Lalutis, does the irony escape them that they otherwise claim to be proponents of states' rights? But of course, this is politics, so it's not about logical or principled consistency. But all joking aside, this is a profound threat, not only in this state, but in this country. If you think about the ways in which, lawmakers can be increasingly distanced from accountability to the broad electorate. And that's the fundamental issue here.
There's a question about, at this point, such as gerrymandered political maps, is there anything that can be done to give voters of color greater voice?
Well, I mean, again, going back to some of the things I was saying, which is, really using existing organizations and resources, whether it's religious organizations, NAACP, there are a whole variety of groups, nonprofits in the state, who I think are making a special effort to try to get minority voters, particularly in rural areas, where their voting participation rates are lower, to get them to the polls, to figure out how to do that, to figure out how to provide them with the resources, and also just the preparation of for that, and also trying to watch and secure their right to do that. I mean, the Republicans are using poll watchers to try to intimidate voters who maybe are first-time voters or not familiar with the process, and so there's a need for people to be out there watching over and helping protect people's rights to go to the polls. I mean, I think there are a lot of people out there right now who are working very hard on this particular issue, which gives me some hope for the coming elections.
And that work can sometimes seem so daunting. But if you need inspiration, go get a copy of Bob's Civil Rights Unionism and read about those extraordinary men and women in the tobacco factories there and in the stimmeries in eastern North Carolina who at the height of Jim Crow, even in the face of those challenges, those obstacles, managed to have a political voice and to begin to change the state's politics.
So there's a question about the growing unionization movement in North Carolina. It says somewhat under the radar, but focusing on low-income workers, predominantly people of color, using various creative strategies. Any comment on that?
Yeah, I think I think that's a kind of component of this kind of larger effort at mobilizing people in the state. So there are various workers groups. Some of them are affiliated with AFL-CIO, other groups like Black Workers for Justice in Eastern North Carolina, other organizing groups that are not necessarily, they're not unions, but they're trying to get workers to address some of the issues in their workplace, maybe not through formal organizing, but through either protest or some other forms of intervention with supervisors and stuff. I think those, a lot of those people are, are kind of have a common sense of what the goals are, because workers' rights in this state are probably some of the worst in the United States, and it's no coincidence that that the lack of a real open democracy is part of what's to blame here. I mean, we have a law that prohibits collective bargaining by state employees. That was passed in the late 1950s when sanitation workers and other municipal workers in Charlotte and other places in the state, mostly African American, had enough of the bad working conditions and poor pay, and started to organize and wanted to affiliate with the Teamsters of the AFL-CIO. And then the legislature comes in, oh, no, you can't do that. That's against the law. We're gonna pass the law. It makes it very difficult to organize. So these things, these rights issues, whether it's environmental rights, gender rights, civil rights, I mean, all of these things are very interconnected. And so I think that it's interesting to see the way, and I agree, it's still kind of behind the scenes in North Carolina, the way that people are trying to re-emphasize the need for worker struggles in the state.
Yeah, I think it's, again, just really important to understand that historically the struggle for voting rights and the struggle for economic rights have always been, in many respects, one and the same. But that's not how most Americans think about, the issues of race and voting rights. Think about the civil rights movement. When you say civil rights movement to a group of students, they think the March on Washington. And they think the March on Washington was primarily about the dream of social integration. Well, what they tend not to know is that it was called the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. All right, there are those two things connected. And I think most people also don't understand or know historically that how closely tied together the labor movement and the civil rights movement have been in this country. Now, there's been lots of racism, in the labor movement, but also, organized labor has been, particularly the unions of the CIO, an extraordinarily important progressive force. I'm going to plug another book. Before this one, Bob and I wrote a book on the war on poverty in North Carolina called To Right These Wrongs. And part of that story is a story of how important organized labor was to this combined struggle in the 1960s for both racial equality and economic democracy.
Well, I'd like to thank both of our gentlemen this evening. It's been an amazing program and amazing discussion. And now, Mary, would you like to introduce Vicki, who will give a little bit of information about how you can vote and when you can vote and all of that?
At this time, I would like to introduce Vicki Shea. Vicki is a member of the Western Chatham chapter NAACP, member of the League of Women's Voter, and a longtime advocate for voting rights. Vicki will be presenting information on voting in Chatham County, followed by questions.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen, I hope, and interject some notes of optimism, because voting in Chatham County is so much easier than it used to be. For one thing, This is the information about the Board of Election. The Board of Election staff in Chatham County are very professional, they're very friendly, and they're very helpful. So anyone can, or you can call and email them if you have questions that I don't answer this evening. And I do want to say that I'm just a volunteer, so official or complete and correct answers are available from the board, but I'm going to do my best. In North Carolina, there are currently 3 ways to vote. You can vote early, you can vote by mail, or you can vote on election day. And early voting is by far the easiest. We now have 17 long days of early voting, and you can see the schedule here. Early voting begins Thursday of next week, which is October 20th, and it ends on Saturday, November 5th. And you can see here that there are voting times on 3 Saturdays, and we also have now achieved voting on 2 Sunday afternoons on the two weekends during this time. So there are lots of opportunities for people to vote when the lines are short and times that are convenient for their schedules. There are also, as you'll see on this, 5 early voting sites in the county, and you can vote at any of them. And also note that you can register and vote at the same time at early voting. So if you've moved to the county or if you've moved within the county, you can go to one of these early voting locations and register and vote at the same time. For this November election and this fall 2022 election, there is no photo ID requirement. And as the professors mentioned, that's up in the air and in the courts, but you do not have to bring a photo ID of any kind to this current election. If you've newly moved to the county and they can't verify your identity, some people have to establish that they live here, which they can do by presenting either a photo ID, but also a utility bill or a government bill or a bank statement or something like that that ties them to their address. And finally, in North Carolina, there's no reason or excuse needed to vote early or vote by mail, where there is in some other states. Any voter can choose to vote by mail or during early voting without having to explain why. Another way to vote is to vote by mail, which is a multi-step process and is somewhat more complicated than going to early voting, but it can be done and anybody can choose to do it. You have to request the ballot using an official form. You can't just send an email. But you can use the online absentee ballot portal and get the whole process of early voting that way. Or you can get a paper form and fill it out and mail it in. Or you can call the Board of Elections and they will send an absentee ballot request to you. You return the request to the Board of Elections and receive the ballot. And then when you complete the ballot, it's very important to follow the directions and complete both the ballot and the envelope. And you're probably aware that in some other states, there are even minor issues with putting the date or signing your full signature on the envelope, not even the ballot, can be problematic. And in North Carolina now, you vote by mail with either 2 witnesses or 1 notary public. During 2020, they reduced the number of witnesses required to 1, but now it's 2. You return the ballot and the envelope, but following the directions, only certain people can handle that voted ballot and can return it. There was a recent court case that has increased the options for people with disabilities, but otherwise only the voter, a relative, or a guardian can return the ballot. You can return it by mail. It needs a 60-cent stamp, which is a forever stamp. Or you can take the voted ballot sealed into its envelope and turn the whole thing in at an early voting location. Or on election day, it can be taken to the Board of Elections office. So again, there are multiple options available. Regular registration to vote ends tomorrow at 5 o'clock. But as I said, it is possible to register for during early voting. And to request an absentee ballot, the Board of Elections has to receive it by November 1st. If they process it and send it to you, you have to return it by 5 o'clock on November 8th. So that's a very tight deadline, given the state of the US Post Office. So we really do recommend that either people plan ahead or do all of this early voting much earlier, or make plans to take that voted ballot and its envelope to the Board of Elections office or to early voting. There's a little bit of a kerfuffle this year because people, if the ballot has been postmarked on or before Election Day, there should be a grace period of 3 business days. Well, 3 business days is November 11th, which is Veterans Day and a holiday. So technically by state law, people have until the 14th, but there's some disagreement and arguing with the Board of Elections about whether that big of a grace period should be given. Voting on Election Day is on Tuesday, the 8th. All polls in North Carolina are open from 6:30 in the morning until 7:30. But if a voter is in line at 7:30, the voter should stay in line, and they are legally entitled to be able to vote, even if the lines are long and they're in line. People are supposed to vote at the assigned polling place for their home precinct. If necessary, if they can, we do have what you refer to as out of precinct voting. So if you can't get to your home precinct, you can vote provisionally at another precinct, and any races that are on the ballot that would have been in your precinct that are on the same ballot that you're given at the other precinct, those would be counted. And actually in Chatham County this time, there are no precinct changes. If you don't know where to vote, what your polling place is, this is what the voter database search looks like for the North Carolina State Board of Elections. You can look yourself up and find your polling place and find some other information also. These are all the precincts, the polling places that are assigned in Chatham County based on where you live. So you can see the addresses there and the name of the precinct and the place that you're supposed to go. And you can even click on this link and see a picture of your voting place if you're not sure what the fire station looks like in Goldston or whatever. On this look yourself up, you can also see your own sample ballot, so that if you want to get the names of people who are going to be on the ballot for you and do some investigation to find out who you think you want to vote for, you can get a sample ballot. You can take a sample ballot and mark it, or be given a sample ballot and mark it and take it into the polls. That's legal. You can have also a list of the people that you want to vote for on your phone. You can take the phone into your polling place. You're not allowed to take pictures in there, but you can look at your own list on your phone to help you remember all these names, who you want to vote for. Again, the Chatham Board of Elections are extremely friendly and helpful, and you can call them with any question. Although, as you can imagine, they get a lot of phone calls. So another way, all of these forms and all of this information is available on the Chatham Board of Elections website. The easiest way to get there is to Google it, because they don't have a website address that's short and complete and easy to remember. There is a Chatham County in Georgia, and so it's important to remember to put North Carolina into your Google, or you're going to get Georgia information, which is going to be extremely confusing. The other thing I want to say is that to get nonpartisan information about all these candidates, the League of Women Voters has an excellent, extensive online presence, vote411.org. And among other things, candidates are asked questions by the league, and they type in their own answers, and there's no editing. So there's no editor in between the voter and the candidates, and you can look and see what their positions are on various issues that might help you make a decision.
So Vicki, this is Rita from the library. You've got a question in the chat that says, If you registered an absentee ballot, can you go vote early instead?
Yes, absolutely. If you ask for an absentee ballot, you have two choices. Either you can vote that ballot and take it in and turn it in, or you can tear it up and go just vote just like a regular person as if you never had an absentee ballot. The election system will only accept one ballot from each voter. So whichever gets to the Board of Elections first is going to be the ballot that counts. And whether by mistake or on purpose, you try to vote twice, the computer's going to kick it out. If it's clearly a mistake, no harm, no foul, but it's illegal to attempt to vote twice. So if there's any hint of nefarious action, that would be followed up by the Board of Elections. Any other questions? That was whizzing past voting laws that can take multiple hours, but there you go.
I think everyone has said, thank you, Vicki. Mary, if you'd say good night to everyone, that would be great.
Good night to everyone.
Thank you again for joining us this evening. We hope you have been inspired by tonight's very powerful presentations and learned a great deal about why it's important to vote. Again, we invite you to join the CRC-C by going to our website, crc-c.org, and stroll down the homepage to Join Us section. Before closing, I would like to give special thanks to our special guests. Thanks to our host, Ms. Rita, and the Chatham Community Library. And thanks to each one of you for being here tonight. Have a wonderful and safe weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.